there, and welcome back to all those who've been watching this, the first part of this video. In this second part, I'd like to get into more details with respect to this so-called alternative method of mine. And for those of you who may wonder, why the hell is there a need to focus on such a narrow topic, given the fact that there are already well-proven techniques for bending guitar sides, for example. Well, why can't we just use the same techniques? In fact, of course you can, and most people do, and have done. However, if you're new to the trade and don't have much experience with bending wood, believe it or not, chances are that bending wood bindings may turn out to be quite a bit trickier than bending guitar sides. Now here's why. Guitar sides are usually made out of wood that in most cases do not show much figure, such as mahogany, rosewood, cocobolo, for example. So in most cases, these woods are not as prone to cracking as those often used in wood bindings. Here I'm thinking of curly maple, for example, which is used quite often, curly koa, or some dense woods, very dense woods, such as ebony, for example, that is notoriously difficult to bend. Now the second reason is that pieces of binding are much narrower, of course, than guitar sides, and as such much more delicate. You can afford breaking a few fibers on the surface of a side without affecting its structural integrity. But you don't have that freedom in the case of the narrower pieces of binding. Before going any further, let me talk briefly about the two most popular techniques for bending wood in the guitar trade and outline some of their weaknesses, I would say, when it comes time to use them for guitar binding. Now, about using a bending iron or hot pipe. In this technique, the wood is soaked in water or simply moistened and brought in contact with the hot metal surface of the iron in order to generate steam. And essentially, as you see here, it's rolled back and forth to generate steam, and as the wood softens, essentially you try to generate the curve that you want the best you can. Now, some numbers should be kept in mind. Wood bends best between 20% and 30% humidity content. And once the wood is dry to about 6 to 8%, it's virtually impossible to bend it to a small radius. So when using this technique, constant care must be taken that sufficient moisture remain in the wood to generate the steam necessary to plasticize the wood into its new shape. So that's why this type of spring bottle is always nearby whenever you use a bending iron like this one. Now I must admit that it takes quite a while before you master that technique. People who do that 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, will learn how to do it very well within a month. But for most people who don't build guitars regularly, it can be pretty tricky. And my personal experience as a small builder, whose output is on average 6, 8, 10 guitars a year on some year, is that I have good days and bad days. On some days, the planets are all well aligned and everything works fine. On other days, nothing works, and I end up at the end of the day with a bunch of broken pieces of binding. And still, even in my good days, it always remains a challenge to get a good fit over the whole length of the binding channel. Contrary to plastic bindings, wood bindings cannot easily be convinced to get tight in there if the correct curvature is not present in the first place. The Fox style bender is another tool that you often find in guitar shops. Here's an example of mine at work bending a rosewood side on a cutaway for a gypsy style acoustic. And as you may appreciate, the bend in the cutaway area is quite sharp, but the bender, as most times, did a really clean job, no crack whatsoever. So why can't we use this bender to bend the pieces of binding at the same time? Well, I've done that before, and in some cases it works fine, especially for the non-cutaway side. But for the cutaway side, it's always a problem. So you can do it, but because of the way this tool works, there's always a point at which the pieces being bent are not in close contact with the metal slats. In most cases, it's not critical when bending sides, but it's another story for the fragile pieces of binding that need to be supported at all times. So let me here summarize the problems we're facing and propose some solutions. First, problem number one, the moisture loss as pieces are being bent. The solution that I propose is to keep the piece in a sealed environment, for example, aluminum foil. I may want to emphasize here that this has been proposed before. I don't have the exact reference, and should some of you know who was the first one to suggest that, I would appreciate if you would email me and let me know. So anyway, let's try to keep the piece in a sealed environment. The problem number two is getting a tight fit to the bending channel. The other solution I propose is to increase the wood plasticity through the use of plasticizing agents such as ammonia or other alkalis such as sodium hydroxide and trisodium phosphate, TSP for example, could be another candidate. And the second part of the solution is to use molds and pressure braces to force the binding to set into the exact shape it will have to assume when it is glued to the binding channel. Now, as far as implementing the solution to problem number one, using aluminum foil, it's pretty straightforward. It doesn't require much more explanation. I've found aluminum foil to be fairly inert and strong enough for the job at hand, especially if you use the heavy-duty type that you can find in any store, really. As far as the use of plasticizing agent, it requires a bit more explanation, and you'll understand why. Wood can be seen as a bunch of rods attached together, tied together through a polymer known as lignin. And when you plasticize the wood, you essentially weakens that lignin polymer, allow it to bend. Now, steam does that, and alkalis do that as well. It's just that alkalis like ammonia and sodium hydroxide are quite a bit more powerful or efficient at allowing this bending to take place. Now, one of the problem with stronger plasticizing agents such as sodium hydroxide, which is Drano, by the way, is that it tends to react with the wood, as it's quite a bit more powerful than household ammonia. So it's a very powerful agent. It does work very well, but unfortunately, its reaction with the wood fibers you know, often colors the wood a bit. And so what I'd like to do is to show you some examples of pieces of wood that I've bent with ammonia, and pieces of wood that I've bent with sodium hydroxide. Now here's an example of using sodium hydroxide as a plasticizing agent. The problem with sodium hydroxide is that it's a very powerful agent, and using that, you really can bend your piece of wood to any kind of shape you like. The problem is that it tends to react with the lignin in the wood and color it a bit, as you can see in this picture. So it leaves kind of a yellow brownish spots, you know, all over the place. So it gives quite a bit of character to the flame maple, but this may not be something that you like to see. In that case, I'd recommend staying with ammonia, which is much more gentle. Now here's another example. In this case, two pieces of mahogany from the same stock were bent. The bottom one, as you see in this picture, the bottom one was bent using ammonia, and the top one using sodium hydroxide. So in both cases, no scorching, clean bend, but as you can appreciate, the sodium hydroxide darkened the mahogany piece, you know, into some kind of a light brown color. Again, this is something that some of you may like, some others may not. But so again, if you want to stay as close to the original color, stay with ammonia. Here's something else. As you can see, this is a wood helix made out of mahogany. It's a piece that I bent in about 30 seconds flat using a wood rod of about 1¼ inch diameter, and it was bent using sodium hydroxide, and this piece is mahogany. And again, you can see that it's been colored kind of a light brown, but it retains its structural integrity, you know, and it remains quite amazingly quite flexible. So sodium hydroxide is really a pretty powerful plasticizing agent. So my recommendation thus would be to use household ammonia for your first test on a piece of scrap and see how it works for you. And then why not, just for fun, try a solution of say 10–20% sodium hydroxide, again Drano, but just make sure that you wear gloves and goggles when you work with that stuff. You know, it can be pretty harmful. The next point I'd like to address has to do with the container into which the initial immersion will take place. An easy solution to this is to use an ABS pipe like this one that has been capped at both ends like this and cut in half lengthwise to give two half pieces like these ones. So the nice thing about that is that you don't need much solution to cover your clip. And the other nice thing is that you can close it like this to prevent evaporation, but also in the case of ammonia, it's kind of smelly, and it's not that harmful, but still I'd rather avoid the smell. So you can leave it, you know, in that container for 30 minutes, an hour, and there will essentially be no evaporation. Now this is my standard scrap model for short pieces, and of course I have a gigantic 36 inches long one for the full-size pieces. Now the next point that I'd like to cover has to do with the curves. Now, one of the key points of this method is making sure that once bent, the pieces are quickly set to cure in a position identical to the one that the piece will assume on the guitar. Now, the easiest way I've found to do that is to actually use the mold that I'm using for the guitar that I'm building. Let me give you an example. Here's the mold for my 15-inch arch top. It's made out of 3 stacked layers, 3/4 of an inch thick MDF that are screwed on top of each other. On top of that, you can see that there's a little piece here, and there's another one at the top, and there's some screws. And if I remove these screws, the mold splits in half. And moreover, let's go on the other side. You can see that on that side, I have the screws here, and if I remove these screws, you can realize that I'm going to end up with two halves of the mold, and this is the contour that the binding will have to assume. And now you can see that it's also covered with aluminum foil. So I'm going to come to that in a minute. Okay, now here are the 2 half pieces of the mold. The first, the cutaway part, and the non-cutaway part. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these parts are covered with aluminum foil, both inside the mold and also on the side of the mold. And the reason why I'm doing that is, of course, to protect the mold a bit from the pressure, but more importantly, to help in the heat transfer between the heat gun and the piece. Now, keep in mind that the piece is going to be under pressure onto this surface, and without this metal, it could be pretty tricky to have a good heat transfer when you heat it from the top. So believe me, if you heat this section here, you can be sure that the heat is going to be transferred really easily to that inner surface and will provide a good heat transfer to the piece of binding. Now, the next parts that you need are the what I call the pressure braces, or the clamping braces. And here's the one that is a perfect match to the non-cutaway side. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it goes this way to the cutaway side. And as far as the cutaway area, I'm using 2 coils. One long one that cover this part, and a shorter one that you've seen before that covers this part. So I think we could probably design something that would work with only one brace, but I've found it easier to work with 2 braces. Now, just one word of a minor detail, but I think that could be pretty critical, is when you cut these pressure braces, cut them to a radius of about 7 or 8,000 of an inch smaller than the outside mold. And the reason for that is that even though it looked like a perfect match here, it's not really, I mean, the inside the curvature of the inside piece is about, you know, a 16th of an inch, a bit more smaller. And the reason for that is that you have to match that piece to the inside curvature of the binding and not to the outside curvature of the binding. Now that may seem to most of you a really minor, useless detail, but believe it or not, it makes a difference, especially in this area, for which the bending radius is quite small. It doesn't make much difference, of course, in this part, but here it may make a difference between a really tight and clean fit and a loose fit. Now, in this very short section of the video, I'd like to summarize the sequence of operation in more detail than I did in part one. And rest assured, by the way, that I do go quite a bit more slowly when I bend piece than what I show in that kind of show-off video in the first part. So, first, immerse your piece in the ammonia bath for, say, 30 minutes or so. Then, wrap the piece into heavy-duty aluminum foil. 2 layers should be more than adequate. For the non-cutaway side, heat the piece uniformly with your heating gun at the high heat setting. Spending a bit more time, of course, in the waistband area. Do not rush it, but heating it for 3 or 4 minutes on both sides should be more than adequate. Now, for the cutaway side, I strongly recommend to use your bending iron or bending pipe to give the cutaway area some kind of a rough shape, you know, that it will assume into the mold. It's you know, unless you use sodium hydroxide, you know, it's better to stay on the safe side and go a bit more slowly. But if you give the cutaway the rough shape, the ammonia will do the work when you put it in place. Now, put the pressure braces in place and heat the pieces with your heating gun for 2 or 3 minutes, making sure that you heat both sides of the binding. Then let the whole thing cool down for about 10 minutes or so. Then remove the aluminum foil, reposition the piece into the mold, clamp the pressure braces, and then heat it again for 2 or 3 minutes on both sides. Then finally let the piece cool down for about, you know, half an hour or so, et voila, work done. So that's about it. I hope that some of that information, at least, will be helpful in your next project. And don't hesitate to send me your comments if you have any. And finally, all the best to you, and thanks for watching.